I was born in the United States, but I lived in Hong Kong for many years. My business in Asia was a huge success, and I became quite wealthy after 20 years. I decided to visit my home in New York on my way from Hong Kong to New York. I stayed 1 week in California, where I had a friend who lived in the city of San Francisco. His name was Mun Dampier, and he had been my friend for many years. We had written many letters to each other. I haven't heard from him in a while. Dampier had never had a job. His father gave him a little money, so Dampier had never worked. He was a superstitious man. He believed that luck or magic could make things happen in his life. He spent most of his time reading strange books. Most of the books were about occult philosophy. I called them books about magic. As soon as I arrived in San Francisco, I sent a message to Dampier's house. The message said I was staying in San Francisco for 3 days and would love to visit you. Dampier was so sweet and surprised me an hour later. He sent a servant to my hotel with the reply, "Come to my house at once, my dear friend." He wrote, "Come this evening. You'll remember the house. I'm sure it was my father's home. I live in a tower at one end of the house. You don't have to ring the bell or knock on the door. I'll tell the servants to go to bed, and I'll leave the front door of the tower open. Come up the stairs immediately. I'll be waiting for you. Please come soon." I rode in a cab to Dampier's house that evening. The weather was stormy, with a strong wind blowing and cold rain falling. I had forgotten that California is cold and wet in winter. I only remembered the sunshine, not the wind and rain. Dampier's house was near the Pacific Ocean. It was a lovely 2-story brick house with a tower at one end. It was surrounded by a beautiful garden with many trees and gorgeous plants. But it was winter, so the trees and plants were bare. The driver stopped his cab near the tower, even though the front door was only 5 yards away. I got out of the cab and ran to the door of the tower, turned the handle and opened it. The door was unlocked, so I opened it. There was just a little lamp burning on the stairway, but it gave enough light for me to see. The hall was full of shadows, so I climbed the stairs slowly, touching the wall with my fingers at the top. There was another door, and I opened it. I went into a room that was lit with another little lamp. Dampier came forward, held my hand, and shook it. He was wearing a long silk coat and soft leather slippers on his feet. His clothes were old-fashioned and strange. We looked at each other, and I was shocked. I had not seen Dampier for many years. My friend has changed a lot. He had been a handsome man, but now his hair was gray, and his face was very pale. There were many lines around his eyes and mouth. Dampier looked like a thin old man, but he was not older than 50. His large and bright eyes shone strangely in the shadowy room. "Welcome, my friend. Please take a seat. Please sit down," he said, offering me a glass of wine and a cigar. We chatted for a bit, but I'm afraid our conversation wasn't as engaging as it could have been. Meeting friends after so many years can be challenging, and it can make you feel a bit down. Maybe Dampier sensed my unease and said, "I know it's been a while, but I'm still here, and I'm still me." I tried to make a joke saying, "Your Latin hasn't improved much." He smiled and replied, "I know, right? Latin is a dead language, and I'm a dead man," he said, and then his smile disappeared. He looked at me with sad eyes and said, "I'll die very soon." I didn't know what to say. I smoked my cigar and drank my wine. We were both silent for several minutes. Outside, the wind had stopped blowing. I suddenly felt like leaving the house. Then I heard a strange noise. It was the sound of someone or something knocking. It was coming from one wall of the tower. The sound was soft and slow. It wasn't the sound of someone knocking loudly. I heard a loud knock on the door, followed by soft taps. It sounded like someone sending a signal or a message. Dampier had forgotten me. He was staring at the wall, with a strange expression on his face. My friend looked excited and afraid, with his eyes shining brightly. I didn't know what to do. Should I go or stay? I stood up and said, "I'll leave, but may I visit you tomorrow?" Dampier turned his head and looked at me. "Please stay," he said. "It's no problem. Nobody is there." He walked to a small window and opened it. I hadn't noticed the window earlier. "Look," he said. I walked across the room and looked out of the window. I could see nothing except the light of a street lamp and rain falling. No one was standing outside. There was no one near the wall of the tower. "Please don't leave me," Dampier said. "I must tell you a story. You're the only man that I can tell it to. Will you listen to my story?" I wanted to go back to my hotel, Hotel Dampier, and the strange noise made me feel a little uncomfortable. I think that I am a sensible and intelligent man, but I felt a little unhappy and a little frightened in that old tower room. However, I did not want to upset my old friend, so I stayed. "Very well," I said, "I'll stay and listen." Dampier poured me another drink and offered me another cigar. Then he began to tell his story. "I didn't move into this house until my father died. Pierre said that was 10 years ago, when I was about 40 years old. He told me that he got his business, his property, and his money before his death. He lived in a large apartment building on Rincon Hill. Maybe you know that area of San Francisco? Rincon Hill was a fashionable area 50 years ago, but it's run down and neglected now. The owner of the apartment building rented out many of its small rooms. The walls of the rooms were thin, and I could almost put my hand through them. The walls were so thin, you could almost put your hand through them. I was lucky to find a room in a building on Dampier Street. It was cheap, and it was a large room. No one visited me or bothered me. I could study my books quietly. I lived happily on Rincon Hill. One morning, as I was leaving the apartment, I saw a young girl on Dampier Street. She was wearing a white dress and a straw hat. She was wearing brightly colored flowers and ribbons around the. Then I saw the girl's face. It's difficult to find words to describe it. Her face was strange and beautiful. I had never seen such a beautiful face before. I was so happy to see her that I lifted my hat and bowed. She looked at me with shining brown eyes, but she didn't speak. I knew that she was pleased to see me, but she didn't smile. She went into the house and shut the door. I stood and stared at the closed door. Would I see her again? Should I speak to her? Should I see her again? Should I speak to her? Would she speak to me? Maybe you think that these are the thoughts of a much younger man. Maybe you think I'm a bit dumpy, and you're right. But these feelings were new to me. I'd never been in love before. I'd spent too many years with books and too little time with people. Now I believe that you're my only friend. soon none of this will matter. I don't feel foolish when I talk to you." Dampo stopped. After chatting for a few moments, he went on with his story. The next day, I waited in my apartment for many hours. I stared out of the window and watched the street, but the girl didn't come out of the building. I didn't know her name, so I couldn't ask anyone about her. That night I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I sat by the window again and waited. Then suddenly, she came out of the apartment building. I went out too, but when I reached the street, she had disappeared. I didn't see where she had gone, so I walked around the neighborhood. At last I saw her in a narrow street. We smiled at each other, and I could tell she recognized me. I'm sure of that. From that time on, I often went out when the girl went out. She always wore the straw hat with the brightly colored flowers and ribbons on its brim. I didn't follow her. I simply walked around the neighborhood and hoped to see her again. At last, I went to the landlady of the apartment, who is the girl with the pretty face and the straw hat. I asked her, "Is she my niece?" The landlady replied, "Oh, she's a dear girl. She's a servant in this house. She lives here because her parents are dead. She works for me. She cooks and cleans the building. I also sent her to buy our food. She lives at the top of the house. Her room is next to yours, but at the top of the other staircase." Oh, my friend. Oh, I do wish I'd never heard that piece of information. It was so much worse than I ever could have imagined. The girl's room was right next to mine. She was on the other side of that thin wall at night. I put my hand on the wall, and I thought of her. Was her bed by the wall? Was she sleeping only a few inches from my hand? I couldn't study because of the girl. I was so distracted. My mind wasn't clear. I only thought about the girl. I couldn't study my books. When it came to the occult, I'd never wanted to marry. Dampier went on. I'd never wanted a wife and children. I was only interested in learning, and I could never marry a poor, uneducated servant girl. My father would never have given his permission. All my money came from my father. If he had stopped giving me money, well, what happened next? I asked my friend. She looked at me sadly. I stopped waiting for her and stopped watching her. I only studied. I spent all my time reading my books. One hot night I couldn't sleep. Thoughts were racing around and around in my mind. I thought again and again about the beautiful girl I wanted to be with. She was only on the other side of the wall. I tapped on the wall. I tapped very gently 3 times, tap, tap, tap. I tapped again, tap, 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 tap. I felt foolish. I was behaving like a boy who was in love for the first time. I got out of my bed and began to study my books. I was reading a rather unusual book. Dampier said it was a book of occult philosophy by necromantia, which you might call a book of magic and superstition. In his book, necromantia describes how to be a fortune teller. He also wrote about some rather strange and terrible things that happened 3 times. When these things happened 3 times, death would come. Necromantia called this a fatal triad. I believe that a fatal triad has a way of happening. I was reading that strange book by necromantia, whom Dampier said, and I asked myself, why? I heard a sound, Dampier replied. It was a soft tapping sound. It came from beyond the wall. It was the answer to my own signal, tap, tap, tap. I knew that the pretty servant girl was sending a message to me. She wanted me to come to her. I ran to the wall and tapped my signal again, tap, tap, tap. But after that, there was silence. She never replied to any of my other signals. I listened for many hours, but I heard nothing more for many days after that. Then one evening, I went to bed early because I was very tired. In the middle of the night, I awoke suddenly. I heard a soft sound. I opened my eyes and sat up. I heard a soft tapping on the wall beside the bed. In a few moments it stopped. I didn't hear back from her, so I kept listening for days. I looked for her, but I never saw her again. I tried to move on, but I couldn't forget her. Then one night, I went to bed early because I was really tired. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I heard a soft sound, and I opened my eyes and sat up. I heard a soft tapping on the wall next to my bed. In a few moments, I heard the tapping again, and I was going to reply to the signal, but then I stopped. The girl hadn't replied to my last messages, so I thought I'd wait a bit before I replied to her. Dampier drank a little wine, and then continued. I lay in bed listening and he said, but I didn't reply. At last, I must have slept, because when I awoke it was late, and I felt tired. I needed some fresh air, so I left my apartment. The landlady was outside my door. Oh, Mr. Dampier, she said, have you heard the terrible news? My heart began to beat quickly, and my voice shook a little when I answered. What news? My poor niece had been sick for a week. The landlady replied, I've seen you watching her. I didn't know she was ill, I said. I'm so sorry, she replied. I didn't know you'd been looking after her. I'm so sorry. I was thinking about my books and thinking about her. I couldn't remember how long it had been since I'd seen the girl. A few days, maybe? I couldn't remember. And how is your niece now? I asked the landlady. I'm sorry, sir, she replied. She was very ill last night, and I took care of her. The poor girl had made only one request. She wanted her bed to be moved. She wanted her bed to be beside the wall next to your room. So we moved her bed, which made her feel happier. She was such a poor thing. Then she touched the wall and smiled. A few hours later she died. The expression on Dampier's face was terrible. There were tears in his eyes as he continued his story. When I heard this news, I was so sad. My friend said, I didn't know what to say. What had I done? I had sent my thoughts to the girl, and she had answered. I had not called out in words. I had used the power of my mind. He used occult philosophy magic to send her a message. Dampier was silent for a few minutes, and then he went on. A few days later, I heard the sad news of my father's passing. I left the apartment on Ranong Hill and came to his house. This house has been my home since then. I've been waiting here in this tower for 10 years. I've been waiting for a visitor. I wasn't expecting to see you, but your visit wasn't a surprise. Necromantia tells us how signs are repeated 3 times. You've heard my story, and I'm so grateful you're here. I'm asking for your help. Do you think my story has happened because of a fatal triad? I heard the tapping twice before the first time. I tried to find the person who made the noise the second time. Many signals were sent to me, but I didn't reply. Now you've heard the tapping too. That was the 3rd time the fatal triad. It's all done. I said, standing up and shaking Dampier's hand. My friend knew I understood his sadness and pain, so he pressed my hand with his fingers and smiled. "Good night," I said, and there was nothing more to say. The next morning, a servant came from Dampier's house with sad news. My dear friend Mun Dampier had died in the night. The voiceover in this video is an English Learning Hub. Please don't copy or re-upload it.